Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other, and today's episode is Merlin Season 4, Episode 1, The Darkest Hour. Episode in a nutshell is a brief reminder of what happens in the episode. In this case, it is a double-length episode, so the summary may be a bit longer than usual. So the episode begins with a cloaked figure who is dragging a cart that is approached by the Knights of Camelot, and this cloaked figure is then revealed to be Morgana, who does use her magic to attack the knights, knocking them all out, and then she goes to the cart where we discover that a scarred Morgause is lying there, and they have a destination in mind. We then have a brief little stint where we return to Camelot, where we see that they are preparing for the Feast of Samhain, and it's super busy everywhere. We see many of the knights from the end of the last season who are knighted wandering around in their daily lives. Clearly everything's happy, everything's peaceful at this particular time. And then we go back to Morgana, who arrives at the Isle of the Blessed with Morgause, and they pay the ferryman to go across, and Morgause is clearly not in a good state. In addition to the scarring on one half of her face, she's also slouched and seemingly crippled on the other side, needing the support of Morgana to be able to walk to the ferry, and then from the ferry onto the Isle of the Blessed. Uther himself also is not doing very well, as we do see that he has become frail and kind of destitute. He's sitting absent-minded, staring off into space. All of his hair is much grayer than it was before, and he's not really interacting with everyone, so he has actually gone somewhat catatonic at this point. And then we have the knights who Morgana knocked out, returning to Camelot to report to Arthur, who has been running things in his father's stead, alongside Agravain, who is his uncle on his mother's side, so his maternal uncle. And with the knight's report, it's suggested that they should start to send out some patrols, but then the feast begins that night. After seeing the revelry at the feast, we then cut to Morgana, who is in the darkened, destitute Isle of the Blessed that has seemingly been abandoned since Nimwe's death, and we see that Morgana brings Morgause to an altar where Morgause lays down, and she balks at first, not wanting to kill her sister, but her sister gives her the dagger, says there's nothing left for her here anymore, and let her sacrifice be her last gift to her, and Morgana ultimately does cast a spell before stabbing into Morgause and tearing open the veil between the world of the living and the dead. When this happens, Merlin feels it, and he basically, it dims out the hall. It has like the pounding sound of like blood rushing, everything slows down, and then we see the Kellic appear, who is the guardian of the gateway between the living and the dead, saying his name several times before Merlin ultimately, well, his name as Emrys multiple times, and then Merlin faints. And Morgana then is able to see the Kellic next, and the Kellic basically says, here's what you've done, you know, you've created a new world, you've unleashed the spirits of the dead, and you're not going to walk alone in it now that you have done something this evil. And she basically warns Morgana that Emrys is her destiny and her doom, and that she needs to watch out for him. Merlin, who has now been moved into Gaius's chambers and has finally woken up from his faint, discusses with Gaius seeing the Kellic and what that could possibly mean. And then the next day we see Drea, who is a girl from a village, report that her village and her family have all been wiped out and attacked by the Darok. And so, well, we don't know it's the Darok at that point, but has been attacked by figures that are there and not there, and don't even seem real, but are real, and, she's basically reporting ghosts. They've seen ghosts. So the knights and Merlin and Arthur ride out to investigate the village, which they find in a destitute state, too quiet, raggedy, dim, no fires anywhere, no people left, just destitute. And then the entire time that they're there, they're getting a backdrop of screams. And then as they're investigating, they do end up being attacked by one of the Drakh, which then, prompts them to return to Camelot. And once they've returned, they of course have their discussions about what they've seen. Gaius indicates what his books have said about past rituals in which Drakh could be released from the world of the dead onto the world of the living. We see multiple refugees arriving, showing that multiple villages are being attacked, though not as severely as the first one. And then it is revealed, of course, that in order to close this veil, a sacrifice of somebody's life is going to be needed. And Arthur, of course, decides that should be him, as he is the one responsible for the lives of his people, being the Prince Regent at this point. Agravain, who is Arthur's uncle, we then see him report to Morgana about what everybody has decided and been discussing in the castle, and of course she's pleased because Arthur's there, and he does refer to the throne as rightfully Morgana's. Then Arthur heads out to sacrifice himself, and as he does so, Merlin, who is with him, counterplots to sacrifice himself in Arthur's place. And of course, he has Lancelot as his companion because Lancelot knows about Merlin's magic. Merlin's able to discuss these things with him. And then we also see before they leave that Gwen asks Lancelot to make sure that Arthur returns safe, which then leads all of them to ride out of Camelot and begin their journey through the woods. Morgana dreams of Emrys, or Merlin, in the form of Dragoon the Great. And he basically, in this dream, on a field of dead bodies, asks her if this is what she wanted. And then she wakes up. Obviously, they reach some ruins with the knights then, and Arthur and Merlin go to collect some firewood. And then there is an attack by the Drakh, which ultimately ends up with their torch being put out. And as the fire is the only thing that drives the Drakhs off, this leaves them in a vulnerable position. So they hide out. The knights kind of hear the battle, or rather the crash of things not going well, so they go out and try to find Merlin and Arthur. And just as they're coming up on Merlin and Arthur where they are hiding, one of the Drakh attacks, and Merlin, in order to protect Arthur, places himself in front and ends up getting the full brunt of the Drakh, which is supposed to kill on contact. However, Merlin is not killed. He is frozen, but he is still hanging on to life. However, it is determined that he is no longer able to continue, and so Merlin then is sent back to Camelot with Lancelot taking him there, as Arthur and the other knights continue their journey further forward. Lancelot and Merlin end up by a river for the evening, and as Lancelot lays Merlin down so that he can get the horses unpacked for their camp, he notices that Merlin's hand in the river is acting oddly, and then a droplet of water rises up from the river, revealing that Villia, which are spirits of the brooks and streams, are going to heal Merlin, and they've already started to, and the Villia spokesperson warns Lancelot about the fact that Emrys is needed to help Arthur. It's his destiny. They've already started healing him, and when Lancelot grows concerned about, the Drakh and everything, they promise to protect them for the night by the stream, and they then stay there overnight. Arthur and the knights, meanwhile, make their way through caves as they continue their journey to the Isle of the Blessed. Meanwhile, in Camelot, Agravain shuts out the refugees, and Gwen speaks up to the council, countering this plan, and ultimately her arguments are the ones that win and convince the castle, which makes Agravain weary of her, so he returns back to Morgana once again, and this is where they plot against Gwen, as Morgana reveals that she has seen a future where Gwen sits on her throne, and Agravain, of course, considers her to be the rightful heir, and so they decide to plot against Gwen. Agravain then approaches Guinevere in order for them to speak to. After that, we then return to Merlin and Lancelot, who are continuing their journey. Merlin wakes up the next day at the river, fully healed, all good to go, and he and Lancelot then again continue their journey. Meanwhile, we then see Gwen and Agravain talking as Morgana sneaks into Camelot through the tunnels underneath Camelot, through the waterways, and then sneaks an attack on Gwen as she makes her way home and the guards who are escorting her home. Gaius then goes to check on Gwen, who is supposed to check up on Uther, and finds Uther alone. Then he goes outside, starts to look around, and sees Guinevere unconscious between her guards outside. He brought a torch. We then move on to Merlin and Lance, bunking down in a shack where they do find a villager who was killed by the Durocs, and they basically put on some fires, attempting to sleep the night through, and they do talk about Gwen as they are laying down and hanging out, which then moves us back to where we get a checkup on Gwen, where she has regained consciousness and is being treated by Gaius, and Gaius informs her that the attack did not come from the Duroc and that he fears somebody wishes her ill, though they cannot think of who at the time. We then go back to Lance and Merlin, who have fallen asleep, but as they sleep, the Duroc sends in a cool wind that puts out their fires and candles, and this leads to them having to flee into the night, and as they run through the woods on the horses, they do summon, well, not they, but Merlin summons Kilgara, and Kilgara uses his fires to drive the Duroc away before stopping to have a quick chat with Merlin. He's introduced to Lancelot, and refers to him as the most loyal knight and chivalrous knight, so on and so forth. Basically, Lancelot, in the future prophecies, has a great reputation, which we then see by the end of the episode why. Which then Kilgar confirms once again that the price that not the veil itself, but the Cailleach who guards the veil demands in exchange for closing it, which is of course another life. And Merlin then indicates that he plans to sacrifice his life in place of Arthur's, and Kilgara says that, like, his destiny isn't complete yet, but the world will be empty without him, accepting that this is something that Merlin will do. And then Lance and Merlin continue their journey once again, and they have a conversation about how readily Merlin will sacrifice his life, and Merlin tells him that it's just about having something that you consider worth sacrificing for. They then reunite with the other knights who are just outside of the Isle of the Blessed, and then after that reunion, they all get into the boat with the ferryman, go to the Isle of the Blessed, where they are attacked by wyverns, causing them to be split up. Elian, Percival, and Leon stay behind to attack and fight off the wyverns. Meanwhile, Gawain, Lancelot, Merlin, and Arthur continue on. Gawain is knocked out when he tries to attack the Cailleach when she appears, so he's out pretty quick. Then Arthur basically offers to pay whatever price she wants, knowing that it is his life, and starts to go towards her. However, from behind, Merlin uses magic to knock Arthur unconscious, and the Cailleach then says, "Oh, so you are going to challenge me after all. I thought you might." But Merlin basically says, like, "I'm not challenging you. I'm going to replace Arthur." And then the Cailleach basically says that no matter how willing you are to sacrifice yourself, it is not yet your time to leave the world of humans and the world of the living. And then she turns and he turns to see that Lancelot is willingly at the edge of the veil, and he says a quick goodbye to Merlin before he walks through the veil instead, which does end up paying the price and sealing it. And then the episode ends with the funeral for Lancelot, honoring his sacrifice and his honor while he lived. So now that we've been reminded about what happened in the episode, we'll now rank the episode. And as always, we're going to be ranking on our mostly objective ranking list, followed by the personal ranking list. So on our mostly objective rank values, because it was a double episode, there are quite a bit that apply. Sorry, that was not pronounced well. There are quite a few of the categories that applied to this episode because it was so long. So starting off, we have 1 point for our single episode supporting character introduction, and this was the Kellic. Then we have the 2 points for the multi-episode supporting character introduction, which is Agravain de Bois. Then we have our multi-season supporting character development, which is worth 3 points. And this had a few different ones. So we first get a checkup on Morgause, who is disfigured from... We don't really find out why she's disfigured. I think they want you to think it's the last battle from the last episode, how like the finale of season 3. However, I don't agree with that because she literally got bumped in the back on a wall and ends up falling down unconscious, and then Morgana comes in and starts her screeching, which shakes the building and everything, which is still one of my favorite scenes. But like she didn't get scraped or burned or anything that would cause that kind of scarring, so this seemingly happened off screen. But then when I look online, people say that it was from that battle, and I'm like, I don't see how, based on what I saw on the screen. So there is that as well, but either way, point is, she is now disfigured and crippled, and ultimately she ends up dying at Morgana's hands due to using herself as the sacrifice to rip open the veil as one last, kind of FU to Camelot. Then there's, of course, the fact that Morgana kills Morgause as a sacrifice in order to tear the veil between the worlds, and ultimately from there hears about the prophecy that Emrys is her destiny and doom, which now has her on guard against Emrys, though she luckily does not at this point know who Emrys is. And then the last one, of course, is Lancelot dying by sacrificing himself nobly and honorably in place of both Arthur and Merlin out of love of Guinevere. To be honest, and that's 3 threes, so a total of 9 points there. We, of course, have the successful emotional impact of Lancelot dying. Lancelot was a likable character from the first time that we saw him to this point. And so his death does hurt because it's like, we saw him with just like a very wholesome dream. He wants to be a knight and chivalrous and live up to all of the ideals that a knight is meant to. But then his dream is shattered and he's left to basically be banished before then they run into him again where he's ended up in a bit of a bad way in that sort of gladiatorial bandit den where he's fighting and he ends up being able to save Gwen, whom he had a crush on and who liked him back when they first met, but now he finds out that she's moved on with Arthur and that he'll need to kind of take a step back, so then he leaves brokenhearted. Now he's come back, he's finally gotten his dream of being a knight, but the woman he loves is still not available to him to be together with, even though they do share feelings. She feels her feelings for Arthur are stronger, or it's just that Arthur is richer and has a title. Um, Either way, the point is they then still aren't able to be together, but he is at least able to be a knight. And then we get to this one where she asks him to protect Arthur. He makes a vow, and that vow to the person that he loves is so strong that he ends up ultimately being able to sacrifice himself in Arthur and Merlin's place, closing the veil and saving Camelot, leading to the funeral. And then, of course, at the funeral, there's a nice speech in the background. It's, because there's no body, because he went fully into the veil, they burn his sword and his cape and armor and such. Obviously the spares, because the ones he was wearing at the time, he took into the veil with him. And then, they light the pyre, and Arthur stands with Gwen as it burns, and then Gwen reveals that Lancelot didn't do it for Camelot, he did it for her, which leads to Arthur walking away, and then the courtyard clears out, and we're left with Gwen, the last one still there, crying over the pyre, which I think was beautifully done, and it was a great way to honor Lancelot, and I did feel like it did successfully hit the emotional impact, simply because he was so likable of a character, and we had gotten to know several aspects of his character and gain that attachment over the course of the few episodes that he appeared in, enough so that when he died, it did have enough of a connection to cause and create that emotional impact. So that was another 3. And then we have 2 pieces of world building. We have the Draka, and that is what they are calling the dead spirits that are able to kill humans with a touch, leaving them frozen and dead. And we learn that they are weak to fire and also immune to magic, as when they are investigating the village, Merlin tries to use magic and it fizzles out and it does not work on the Draka at all. The only thing that works on the Draka is fire. And that's why they're basically lighting a bunch of braziers and candles and torches and fireplaces and such to keep that up. But of course, if that goes out, then the Draka have a way in and will be able to attack. And it is implied through some of the reports that are given that many villagers and even knights have died to the Draka throughout the time that they are loose. And then the last world building, also worth 4 points, is for the Villia, which are the spirits of the brooks and streams, who have healing powers and are clearly, as spirits themselves, immune to the Draka and able to protect Lancelot and Merlin while Merlin is being healed from the Draka for that night while they are there, and are clearly good, whereas the Killick and the Draka are not. But there were some negatives in the episode, and the first negative was character regression for Uther. At the end of the last episode, we did see that he was not doing very well in prison, but he was still, not fully far gone. This episode really shows how far he's regressed as a character. Like I said, he's basically standing there. Arthur even comes to say, hey, I'm sacrificing my life, and he doesn't even respond at all to the fact that his son is sitting there saying he's about to die at all. His hair has gone way grayer than it was before, and he's just completely, obviously no longer even fit to reign as king, as Arthur has been taken over all of his duties as Prince Regent, seemingly since Morgana betrayed him. And then we had -2 for a weak subplot concept, and for me that is Agravain. Now, Agravain having something against Uther makes sense, as Uther could be considered to have been responsible for Igraine's death, who was his younger sister. However, Arthur is his blood nephew, the rightful heir and crowned prince to the throne by virtue of being male in that time period, by virtue of being the legitimate child born through a legitimate marriage, and by virtue of the fact that he was crowned prince, which also is basically the acknowledgement that he is the official heir. So why he would think for even a second that a bastard female child from a mistress has the right to the throne and is the rightful heir is absurd for the time period. And additional to that, why would you choose the child of a mistress that your sister was cheated on by her husband with over your genuine blood nephew that your sister died to bring into this world and loved and wanted enough to die to bring them into this world? Like, to me, I feel like there is no logical reason that I can think of why he would be on Morgana's side and not Arthur's side. Not to mention the fact that he has Arthur's trust. He's got a pretty cushy lifestyle being by Arthur's side and one of his main advisors. Like, there's just no gain or motivation, really, for him to betray Arthur. And I just feel like that makes it a weak subplot because it just honestly doesn't really make sense in the overall scheme of things why he would be betraying Arthur like that. So that was -2 points. And then there was also the negative messaging and behaviors. First one, of course, is the kinslaying and assisted suicide of Morgause by Morgana, which is murder. Like, even if she was willing to die, I'm pretty certain assisted suicide's still a crime, and it's still on par, legally at least, with a form of murder. Like, it's a form of murder, so that's very negative messaging or behavior. And then again, Agravain's betrayal of Arthur, which again makes no sense, but he has betrayed Arthur. He is working with Morgana, and that obviously is a betrayal to Arthur, who he has been advising and working with and gaining the trust of. So also worth -2 points, but ultimately that still leaves us with 16 points total. And that does make this a 10 out of 10 episode on our objective ranking. Now, of course, this is the first episode of season 4, therefore it is the only episode on our mostly objective ranking so far for the season, and therefore in first place, The Darkest Hour. Now, for my personal ranking, I'm going to be honest and say that the timing of this episode heavily impacted the score. That's the risk you take when you have a personal ranking that's based on the vibes and the feelings. It's October 30th. It is the perfect time to watch an episode about the veil being ripped apart at Samhain and all of the ghosts. It's just so perfect for the season, and I'm in such a mood for this kind of episode. The episode's atmosphere, everything, that I feel like I may have a little bit more bias towards this episode than I may have had it been any other time of the year. But it's spooky season, it's Halloween tomorrow. I'm watching an episode or a double episode that goes entirely about ghosts and the veil and even has a Samhain feast, and it's basically like the perfect timing for this episode. So I really, really, really was in the mood and really, really enjoyed this episode. As I mentioned on the mostly objective ranking, there were some aspects that didn't make sense, but there are also things that are not necessarily tied to this specific episode. Like, number one, I'm surprised that Morgana, with all her future dreams, never had a dream that she would end up evil or, die by Emerson's hands or anything like that. I'm surprised this is the first time she's finding out about this. But at the same time, maybe her dreams don't really show her herself so much, because most of the dreams that she has had in the past were about other people. So I can make that up for myself and make it make sense. Like I said, I don't get why Agravain would think that Morgana's role is stronger, nor would I understand why he would be against Arthur. Uther, yes, Uther's spell ultimately led to his sister's death, but, his sister wanted a child, his sister carried the child, his sister died for her child, so why is he now plotting against said child, who is a legitimate, born from a legitimate marriage child, a male, and also the crowned prince and official heir? Like, everything about Arthur's claim is very legitimate. Whereas, and this is for the time period, whereas Morgana's is not. She's a bastard child born of a mistress and infidelity. She's female, which at that time mattered. And also, you know, the outcome of Uther's betrayal to his sister by cheating on her. And yet somehow he's on her side and claiming that it's her rightful throne. Like, it makes no sense to me at all why he would be on her side or anything like that. So that's the main negative. But again, that's a plot point that's going to carry on throughout the series, not specific to this episode. And I also feel, in addition to it being like the perfect episode for Halloween, the concept itself was really amazing. We got a little bit more with regards to like the spirit world. We learned about the Villia, which are good spirits who are in the world of living all the time, who are kind of like, well, they're water spirits in the brooks and the rivers, and they're loyal to Emrys and on Emrys's side, and they are able to heal him, which is pretty great. The Kellic is pretty evil. She laughs at the idea that innocent people had died because the veil was opened, and Kilgara even says that she's the one who demands the price to close the veil, that it's not the veil itself, and she could, if she chose, close it again, but she won't without getting a sacrifice. So she's pretty evil, and I did like the makeup on her, like her outfit, her aesthetic. Obviously, we had a lot of castle ruins. The entire episode had a soundtrack of screams in the background and different wails and such to indicate the Killick. There was the haunted atmosphere with like the cold breezes putting out the candles. And when people are touched by the Draka, they end up frozen, and you could see like the frost on them. And this brings me to one of my favorite things about the episode is that it's one of like the first hints that we get that Merlin is immortal, or, like very, very, very difficult to kill at least, because any and every other human who has been touched by the Draka have died. It's an instant death. They freeze, they're done. But Merlin, when he is hit by the Draka, he does freeze and he does end up weakened, but he does not die. He does not die immediately. And then when he gets to the brook, he is able to be fully healed. And even like the Kellic before Lancelot walks through basically declines that Merlin can go through and basically says like you're still required to stay in this realm of the living, like even if you want to and you feel your time's up, like I'm not going to accept you as a sacrifice. And I feel that's because he's immortal. And I know this is a huge spoiler for the ending, but one, it's an old series. Two, this is a rewatch, so my expectation is that everybody's probably already seen it. And so I am going to spoil it, but I gave this warning so people can skip ahead if they need to or want to. But very last scene of the very last episode has an elderly Merlin in the modern era. So we know he is immortal. And I think Emrys itself means something like immortal or eternal or something like that. I've seen that in fan fiction. I don't know if it's addressed in the series, but the point is, Merlin is not only extremely powerful as a mage or a magic person, warlock, whatever, though, to be honest, he does not live up to that extremely powerful label because he comes off as very weak in a lot of circumstances. But beyond that, the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is one of the first episodes that really hints towards that immortality in the fact that things that would kill a normal person did not kill him. He survives the Durak attack, which would not have happened to anybody else. And then in addition to that, the Kellic, who is the guardian of the veil between the living and the dead, refuses his sacrifice, even though he's willing to. And I think that just is great, foreshadowing to the fact that he is immortal, and that maybe most of his power is not necessarily like attack offensive power, but maybe some of his strength and him being the most powerful has to do with those aspects of him. Because, like I said, he has proven himself to not necessarily be the strongest spell user, in the world in multiple episodes up to this point. So saying that he is bar none the most powerful at this point, we know is like a lie. Anyways, point being, the vibes were all there. The foreshadowing was on point. The things I didn't like weren't necessarily specific to this episode, but more so a subplot that will continue on throughout at least most of the next upcoming episodes of the series. And therefore, ultimately, I loved this episode. I thought it was very good. And like I said, I could be slightly biased because it's just so perfectly timed that this episode happened to fall on October 30th and be so in line with the season. But I loved it. I really loved it. And that is why I gave it a 10 out of 10. And that brings it on the personal rankings to currently in first place, The Darkest Hour. It is, of course, the only episode so far, but as it is a 10 out of 10, it would take a lot to unseat it from first place. And that now brings us to the series ranking so far. And on our mostly objective ranking, Season 2 is in first with 70.83%, Season 3 in second with 70%, and then Season 1 is currently third place with 69.23%, with Season 4 starting very strong with 10 out of a possible 110 points. Personal ranking side, we had Season 3 in first place with 72.73%, Season 2 in second with 70.83%, and then Season 1 in first with 66.92%. And again, Season 4 is starting strong with a 10 out of a possible 110 points. So with that, we have now rewatched and ranked Merlin Season 4, Episode 1, The Darkest Hour. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.